Welcome, one and all, to HCN Live. This is an opportunity. We've been doing these once a month, and it's a chance for High Country News supporters to get a little look behind the scenes and meet some of the people behind the publication. We are so excited to have you here. Invitations to this event went out to anyone and everyone whose email we've got who has donated to High Country News. HCN is a reader-supported nonprofit. 3/4 of our revenue comes directly from you all in the form of subscriptions and donations. So sending a huge amount of gratitude, and so glad that you're here. My name is Greg Hanscom. I am the executive director and publisher at High Country News, and I am here with an old friend and one of my heroes, Michelle Nijhuis. Welcome, Michelle.
Hi, Greg. Hey, everyone. Thank you for supporting High Country News, which I have loved for almost 25 years now.
Yeah, so Michelle, well, first off, let me mention to everyone out in the audience that you can see and hear us, I trust. We cannot see or hear you, but we do see your comments. So if you've got a question or a comment, or you want to just check in and let us know where you're calling from, just drop it in the chat, and we'll see that. But Michelle, I did want to ask you. So we kind of came up together as journalists at High Country News a few years back.
Basically grew up together at High Country News. It was our finishing school as much as we are ever finished.
Right, our unfinishing school, perhaps it was. Yeah. So what are your just like early memories of High Country News? You arrived in, was it 97?
The beginning of 1998 with JT Thomas. We blew into town in a snowstorm, and you guys were part of our welcoming committee.
That's right. I was a fresh new assistant editor. I had done an internship the year before, and where Betsy Marston really taught me how little I actually knew about writing and taught me a few things about how to write. And then I was just hired back. And I think you and JT were the first class of interns after I was hired.
I think that might be right, though I'm not sure you told us that for a while.
I pretended to be a seasoned.
Yeah, we were really impressed.
Nice. Well, I'm glad I put on a good face.
Oh, totally.
Funny all these years later, and you have remained involved in High Country News as a contributing editor ever since then. Is that true? I mean, you were an intern and then a staffer.
Yeah, I was a staffer, and then I left to go freelance, and then a few months afterward, I remember getting together with you for lunch, and I said, I'd love to be more connected with the paper, and you said, great, what should we call you? I said, well, what's a contributing editor? What do they do?
And there you are on the masthead today as contributing.
Pretty much. That's what I've continued to do. So yeah, I haven't been as involved as you have over the years, but I have stayed, consistently involved in different ways, and always really appreciated being part of the community, the far-flung community that is High Country News. I mean, you can see from the chat, we've got people from all over the West and a couple from Europe, and it always amazes me where you find High Country News supporters and subscribers and former interns, former staffers.
Yeah. 78, almost 80 people who've joined us today. If you've come for the High Country News live chat, you've arrived in the right place. Thank you so much for being here. Well, and Michelle, I have to brag about you a little bit. In addition to being a longtime HCN contributing editor, you have written for just about every big publication in the country. There's The Atlantic, where you're currently a project editor, right?
Project editor, yeah.
And The New Yorker, you wrote a column for them for a while, and National Geographic, and we love to brag about you, Michelle. And of course, most recently, you wrote this beautiful thing.
Yeah,
Which
I did.
I'm so proud to let you know that I finished it.
I hear you keep giving it away.
I keep giving it away. This is the problem. Literally, I must have given away a dozen copies of this book. And so it's been really slow going because I read a chapter and then I'm like, oh, you need this book. You need it more than I do.
Oh, thank you. Your lovely partner told me that she keeps trying to read it, but you keep giving it away.
It's true. In fact, Nate, who is on this call, was one of the recent recipients. I think I cleared off bookshelves across the Northern Rockies on a recent trip of this book, just because I love it. It's been a great read, and I think it is full of kind of that Michelle Nijhuis sense of delight. You have such a gift for finding these really funny little moments and details in your research and your reporting that while this is a pretty heady topic, it made me laugh. I've literally been like reading this to my kids, like tracking them down, 2 teenagers. Wait, stop. You have to hear this. It's really fun.
I'm glad. I'm glad. Often people say, well, I was afraid to read it because I thought it was, about extinction. And it is kind of, but, I tried to make it.
Yeah. So
it's sort of about what else conservation is about other than preventing extinction.
Yeah. So, okay. So give us a little bit of kind of the creation story on this, because I noticed in the acknowledgments at the end of this book, you tell of a bench on the banks of the Thames and your friend Judith basically ordering you to write this book. So what was the seed of the idea for this book, and why was Judith so insistent that you needed to write it?
Oh, well, I was going to tell you the deep origin story, which is probably like when I showed up at High Country News, fresh from a bunch of biology jobs, most recently from Tucson. I was, had gotten an earful about all these conflicts over endangered species and just felt so confused and felt like the discussion was so confused because people were like, what does it mean to save a species? Well, we don't know, or why should we save a species? Who, which one should we save? And I mean, covering endangered species conflicts at High Country News just got me more and more curious about those big questions, which I felt like had been, at least people from the past had come up with some answers, but there was like a whole conversation that I felt like wasn't really documented. You got an idea from biographies of famous conservationists, but you didn't get a sense of like that knowledge and that thinking accumulating over time. And the result was like all these very bitter, confused discussions in town halls where people are like, why are we suddenly responsible for this species? We never did anything to it. And, understandably. But Judith, who also has written for High Country News quite a bit and is a really old friend of mine from Southern California and a travel buddy, I had hemmed and hawed about this idea for years. And we were on a trip together in London, seeing a bunch of plays. And in between a couple of plays, I don't even remember what I was complaining about, some kind of dissatisfaction with my work. And she sat me down and she goes, Michelle, what's that book called? The book you're going to write. And I think that was the first time I told anyone the title.
Oh, really?
So, yeah. Then she goes, you have to write that. And that, I think every writer needs a person like that because there is so much, no matter how great your idea is. And I certainly didn't express this idea very clearly. It took me a long time to express it clearly in a proposal, but there's always some angst along the way, and you need a couple of friends who are like, you're going to get there. You're not there yet, but you're going to get there. And that kept me going through a lot of publishers going, well, we know about Rachel Carson. Why do we need to know anything else about conservation history? Yeah. And my going, I know we do, but I can't explain why yet. And,
so why did you decide to write this book now? Because, it is it is something of a history of the conservation movement. There's more to it than that. But why did you finally decide? Yeah, because I know you and I've worked with you, and I know how much time you spend thinking about a project before really committing to it. I've seen you do. I saw you do this with the climate change reporting that you did early on, and you were like, "It's not ready. It's not ready. It's not ready." And I kept bugging you and bugging you, and finally you said, "Okay, I can write about this now." So why did you decide that this was the book to write right now?
I think that's the kind of muttering that Judith got sick of hearing. I finally said, Nijhuis, you're driving yourself and me crazy. Why now? I mean, I just think a lot of things came together. Like there was that long sort of slow boil of my thinking, there has to be a way to put this story together. This isn't just a random assortment of individual people. This is a tradition, and no one has really told the story of this tradition in an accessible way. And I feel like that would be helpful, but I can't explain why. Then that probably went on for like 20 years. But then a couple of other things, I think more recently, the rise of de-extinction, and what I felt like was, one of my pet peeves is how much coverage de-extinction gets.
Tell us what that is.
For those of you who haven't run across it, though, I feel like it's impossible that you haven't. If you're a High Country News subscriber and you're interested in conservation, I feel like you must have seen some story or another about the possibility of bringing back. Well, right. And, at least you're talking about ferrets and not woolly mammoths, but it's the possibility of creating what are essentially hybrid animals that could be an ecological stand-in for species that we've lost. And I can see why people cover it. It's fascinating, ethically, fascinating scientifically. However, it's not yet possible. And it's also very uncertain as to whether it would make any difference for, life on Earth, the ecological functioning, all the good reasons why we practice conservation. And there's so many other things that we actually know how to do, like protect habitat. And because those are slow, kind of non-flashy, uncertain, gradual processes, they don't get, a 1% of the kind of coverage that de-extinction gets. So that was part of I feel like every author needs like a burr in their bonnet or burr in their britches, something that's really annoying them that they need to write about. And that was mine, because I really felt like, fine, talk about it. This could be useful. I'm not anti-technology, but can we try to make a story out of what's been accomplished in conservation and where we could be going and how we could actually make a difference for these systems that support us and support all these other species. So that was a big part of why now.
Yeah. Well, and you do kind of weave this story together in really beautiful ways. It's not just a sort of it's not a simple chronology. You're often kind of reaching backward and forward in time and kind of referencing figures that showed up in the book previously.
Thanks. That was one of the most fun parts, actually, and some of that, there was part of that in the first drafts, and then it kind of kept getting layered in as I found more little overlaps. In fact, I just ran across one the other week that I thought, oh no, it should have gone in. But I just love how these people were in conversation, either directly or indirectly. It gives one a sense of hope that we've gotten somewhere.
We're getting somewhere, yeah. Hey, before we go on, I just want to shout out to the 87 people who've joined us. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
If you're just landing, this is the High Country News Live conversation with Michelle Nijhuis. And two things I want to say right now. One is we have some copies of this book. I've already said how much I enjoy giving this book away. We have some copies of this book and we'd love to give them away. If you're interested in a copy, put your name in the chat. We're the only ones who will see this. This doesn't go out to the whole group. And we'll just do a little drawing after the after this conversation, and I think we've got 5 copies of the book that we'll send around. Just
a couple interested people.
Yeah. The other thing is that in about 15 or 20 minutes, we're actually going to turn to the audience, and we're going to take your questions for Michelle. So if you've got questions, go ahead and drop those into the chat here as we're talking, and I'll get to those shortly. So, well, okay. So the characters in your book, Michelle, there are some familiar faces in here, some folks who I certainly knew, folks like Aldo Leopold and Gifford Pinchot and John Muir and Rachel Carson. There were also certainly some names that I was less familiar with in here. And I had, the Huxleys, kind of the greater Huxley clan. I didn't realize, who did you have a character or a figure who was new to you, who you felt like you sort of discovered for the first time or particularly enjoyed when you were working on the book?
Well, I felt like even the ones I thought I knew, I discovered new things about. I mean, I've been an Aldo Leopold fangirl for a long time, but I loved getting to know him better. Unfortunately, I could only get to know him through, I make it sound like I went to visit him, but he was so productive during his life that you really, once you dive into his archives, you really do feel like you're talking to him, because every thought in his head he put down in a letter or in a paper to someone. Rosalie Edge was new to me, a suffrage activist from the early 20th century who became, I can tell her story if you're interested, but she was such a character and just flew off the page, in 3 dimensions, and was really fun to write about. I found the Huxleys to be fascinating. This was Julian Huxley, who is the elder brother of Aldous Huxley, the novelist who wrote Brave New World. Family of geniuses, and geniuses usually come with complications, and the Huxleys all do. And I found them fascinating but exhausting to spend time with. Once I finished that chapter, I felt like I had to go on vacation. And then the modern day conservationists I met in Namibia I felt that was just, even though I had read a lot about the community conservancy movement in Namibia and read a lot about community-based conservation, that was just eye-opening to me to spend time with them.
So yeah, tell us a little bit about Edge. Because she had some sharp edges, among other things. Great character. Tell us a little bit about
What a character.
Yeah.
She was born into a wealthy family in New York and came to conservation kind of relatively late in life. She was a suffrage activist. Once that battle was won, she turned to conservation and was kind of a new bird watcher in her early 50s, and became friends with, then as now, there was a whole kind of funny community of birders who frequented Central Park, and some of them were scientists from the Museum of Natural History right across the park from where she lived, and they started telling her, well, the Audubon Society, which we're involved with, is not doing its part to protect birds of prey. And she was horrified by this, like, what? First of all, she was kind of horrified by the complacency of the conservation movement, which, compared to the suffrage movement, she was like, you call this a movement, And then, one of the things I really think is cool about her is that at a time when ecology was such a young science, she really grasped, this isn't just about protecting species you like, guys. Or that you like to hunt. This is about protecting the chain, and she has a couple of quotes where she talks about, the chain that includes us all. And I just think it's lovely that that's what motivated her. And anyway, she took the board of directors of the Audubon Society to public task about their not sticking up for birds of prey. And eventually they caved in fear.
Right.
So she just really told them off in public at a board meeting.
Yeah, you have
Yeah.
that scene, right, where the
Yeah.
board is meeting. It's an official thing, and she not so subtly sort of stands up and asks the
Yeah.
question that they really didn't want to answer.
And she was quite an elegant figure. She'd grown up in Gilded Age, New York, always wore her best dress, even when she was out bird watching. And so she kind of, marched in, and they didn't usually have public comments from members, but she was a life member and stood up and said, "So what's this I hear from these scientists who say that you guys aren't doing your job?" But the thing I really love about Rosalie Edge, and I'll make this quick, but she went on to found Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, which, especially if you're from the East Coast, you may know well. It is a sanctuary in eastern Pennsylvania that was actually used. It was a ridge top where a lot of migratory birds pass over, and historically it was used as a place where the community would go up and actually shoot hawks as they passed overhead, because they thought they were pests. They thought they preyed on livestock or competed with hunters for game birds. Rosalie Edge kind of came in and said, "Oh, it's for sale, I'll buy it." Turned it into a sanctuary, and also then told the caretaker, "I think you should start counting birds. I think you should start counting what goes overhead every year, and what kind of birds are going overhead." And it's now the longest running record of hawk migrations in the world. There are a lot of other hawk count sites that are modeled on Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, but that's the first and the longest record. And that record then, a couple of generations later, or one generation later, was used by Rachel Carson as a piece of evidence in Silent Spring. And it was actually a really central piece of evidence to be able to say, we have these records of bald eagles from, back almost 20 years now, and we know, so we are pretty sure that what we've seen in the past 3 years, which is no young at all, is weird. Wow. And her case was pretty circumstantial. She didn't have a smoking gun when she wrote Silent Spring. She had to kind of say all these things can't be happening at the same time and be totally coincidental. But so that was a central thing for her to be able to say, we have a long record, this is weird, and here's what we think is causing it. So it's thanks to Rosalie Edge that she had that data. They never met, but it's just really one of those examples of how the conservation movement really has been chugging along and learning things.
Yeah, that was interesting to me. I didn't remember that Rachel Carson really didn't have the hard evidence. It really was a lot of observations.
A lot of observations, yeah.
She was making connections that science had not yet made.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, they didn't know about, I'm sure all of you know about the DDT thinning eggshells in birds of prey, and I think in pelicans as well. I don't think they had that until well after the book was published. And there was a lot of really strong anecdotal evidence. She wasn't making anything up, of course, but she had to almost build a lawyerly case for it rather than a scientific case.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, okay, so there are some really remarkable characters in this book. There are also, I think, as you say early in the book, there are a lot of people who did the right thing for the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
And you don't shy away from some of the kind of undercurrents within, especially the early conservation movement, which were pretty abhorrent, really. So you've got, you have people in this book like Madison Grant, for example, who was sort of an avowed white supremacist and deeply racist person who traveled in the circles of some of the most influential conservationists of the day.
Yeah, Hitler's favorite author.
Right.
Yeah.
I think maybe some of that history is better known now than it was a few years ago. Mm-hmm. But I think that for a long time that was a part of the conservation movement that was conveniently sort of swept under the rug. What did you learn about that? And I don't know, how do you square that? With some of the good work that the movement's
I did not necessarily set out for that to be a big part of the book. I think, like most, maybe I was typical in this way among conservationists in thinking, because I knew some of these stories, but thinking, okay, there were some reprehensible individuals, people who, did the wrong thing in the past, but they were individuals. It wasn't something systemic in the conservation movement necessarily. Not that I thought the conservation movement was perfect or anything, but I didn't really make the connection between systemic problems in the conservation movement and these attitudes that were there at the founding of the movement. And the more research I did, the more I really found that I think there is a connection. And I think there have been systemic consequences from some of those early attitudes. And I found it, I don't know if redemptive is the right word, but really satisfying just personally to look straight at all of that and try to make sense of it and try to make sense of what the consequences have been, and be able to, have that in my mind alongside the accomplishments that the conservation movement has made. Because I think some of the same individuals who, for instance, William Hornaday, who was instrumental in saving the bison from extinction, head of the Bronx Zoo, very prescient in the sense that he stood up and said, at a time when people were just kind of getting their heads around extinction, he stood up and said, hey, extinction's happening, it's our fault. And he blamed it on other people, but it's humans' fault. And we have a moral obligation to reverse it. It's possible to reverse it, we need to. And he bred bison in the Bronx and put them out on the prairie, and they thrived. And, they're now part of a much deeper restoration that's going on today. But at the same time that Hornaday was so prescient about other species, he was really just an ogre in so many ways, had horrible attitudes toward people of color, immigrants. And I think I think the way to summarize the effect of those attitudes, which were certainly not majority opinions throughout the conservation movement, but turn up over and over again in the conservation movement in different ways. I think you definitely see a few voices in every generation that takes a kind of overly biological view of our species and accept, their own type of humans. They see their own type of humans as extremely complex, and but everyone else is kind of, sort of can be manipulated like you might manipulate a bunch of fruit flies. That attitude recurs, and I think the effect of it has been to discount the kind of conservation that's been going on for millennia. Because Hornaday, for example, in addition to all those other prejudices, was a terrible elitist. And even though he was a sport hunter, he thought that subsistence hunting was like part of the problem. He didn't see that subsistence hunters and farmers had their own conservation practices. And I think that, even though I would think and hope that conservationists of today have moved past many of those really reprehensible attitudes, that elitism, we're still dealing with that. We're still dealing with this sort of bias toward top-down strategies that exclude local perspectives, whatever those perspectives may be. So, we need laws, we need federal laws, we need parks and reserves, but we need that local knowledge too.
Yeah. So it was really interesting to me to see you land there, towards the end of this book. Again, thinking back to our early days together at High Country News, after your internship, we hired you as a full-time staff writer to cover what was then sort of, captured as collaboration and consensus.
Yeah.
And I remember it was like, oh, poor Michelle. She's got to make
I know.
This is the most boring. So you're like, okay, how do you make a story out of 100 community meetings? How do you make a story out of people working together, peaceably to, it's not the traditional, good guy, bad guy, or sort of clash of powers. So it was, but you did, and it was really interesting to see you kind of land back at this notion of kind of bottom up.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I remember that series, and I remember those stories being so frustrating because, well, I mean, I think as journalists, we can all agree we have a bias toward conflict. You know, we're storytellers, so it's more exciting. You know, what do you do about a story with no conflict? And also, so many of those collaborative efforts would get, you know, a lot of people would put a lot of time and earnest effort into it, and then they would get blown up from the outside by one party or another, or you know, the discussions would break down. And so I left that project feeling kind of like, I don't know about this collaborate, you know, is this just performative? What is the role really of these collaborative efforts? Because, you know, they also had no real authority, you know, the kind of collaboration that we see in North America is mostly in an advisory capacity. And I think there have been examples where it's done really great things. I mean, one of the examples I talk a lot about is the Harney County partnership in Southern Oregon that really managed to hold the community together during the Malheur occupation in 2016 by right-wing extremists, the occupation of the wildlife refuge headquarters. But I think community-led conservation is so much more vibrant outside North America because it's really trying to move some authority from the top down to the bottom, you know, while recognizing that conservation has to be operating on all levels. I mean, I'm not talking about like, let's abolish boundaries and let's abolish federal laws. We need that stuff, but we need conservation to function as a full ecosystem, I think, because if you don't have local support for parks, you know, you have the situation that you have many places in Africa where people are displaced by parks, and then the parks are surrounded by neighbors who have no reason to see that park succeed. Right. So when I returned after many years to looking at these collaborative efforts, and looking at what was going on outside North America, I found those to be really inspiring because they involved real authority, and they were much less, they were much longer term. People had really invested time into building those relationships. It wasn't just an agency putting a call out and saying, who's interested in talking about this forest plan for a few months? You know, these were, and if you look at the ones that have succeeded in the US, like the Harney County partnership, those have been going on for 30 years now. So they take time, and they take real trust, and they take real authority to work.
Yeah. I have 100 more questions for you, but I also am looking at the growing list of questions that are coming in from the audience. So let me, I've got a list of them that I can look at pretty clearly here.
Good.
Quickly, 88 people in the audience. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yay.
This is indeed the High Country News Live conversation with Michelle Nijhuis. I am Greg Hanscom, and I'm the executive director and publisher at HCN. And just once again, this is a once monthly opportunity for all of the amazing people around the region, around the country, and apparently around the world who support this organization to get a look behind the scenes and to get to know some of the people who really make this thing work. So we are, if you put questions in the chat, we're collecting questions, and I'm going to start lobbing questions at you, Michelle, that are coming in from the audience, because there are some good ones. Again, if you're interested in putting your name in the hat for a copy of Michelle's book, Beloved Beasts, just drop it into the chat. We'll do a little drawing at the end. We've got 5 copies of this book to give away. But yeah, let's dive in. Here's a great question that sort of follows what we've been talking about, Michelle. How did you end up going to Namibia? That's from John Trotter. Go ahead.
Okay. I see someone with more experience in Namibia than I have is on the list. Hi, Jeff. Someone who's worked in rhino conservation there for many, many years. So I don't know how I first heard about the community conservancies in Namibia, but one of the, I mean, I had read a lot about the community-led conservation movement, which it's really been going on since the 1980s, when a group of academics and community activists, conservation activists in Southern Africa were like, this top-down model is not working. What can we do? How can we reintroduce some of this local authority and local knowledge into the conservation structure? And Namibia was one of the first places where it started, and it started in a very grassroots way. And then after Namibia attained independence in 1990, it became a nationwide program. So I went there. I felt I was this book actually had several more chapters, several more modern day chapters that my editor forbade me from writing. And
those are for the next book.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what he said. Next book. And so it was painful to have to choose one place that I felt really represented what I saw as the future of conservation. But I felt like Namibia, because it had had so much time to grow, it had grown organically, and then it was nationwide, it was institutionalized. It wasn't a cute little, project that had had some success on a local scale and was really promising. It was something that had fulfilled its promise in many ways, even though, of course, every program has problems, but it has really changed. It's changed wildlife populations in the country. It's changed society, I would say, in many ways in the country. So I was interested. That's how I got interested in trying to document what was going on in Namibia for a North American audience, because it hadn't been very widely reported. Uh-oh.
Sorry, I turned myself off. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Local control is a big part of this. The story in Namibia was really about some conservation-minded outsiders saying, all the work we're doing from the outside doesn't seem to be working. We're watching rhino populations plummet. We're watching other wildlife populations plummet. And it seems to me that it was really about going to the locals, the indigenous folks, and saying, how do you want to do it? And how can we support you?
Yeah, and one of the, Garth Owen Smith, who sadly has passed away since I got to travel with him in Namibia, and was really a catalyst for the whole. He's a South African who fell in love with the landscape and people of Namibia at a young age, and was really instrumental in catalyzing this whole thing from these very early kind of kitchen table conversations. He talks about going around to people's houses. He was working for the South African government and as an kind of an ag extension agent, their equivalent of an ag extension agent, and saying, well, what do you value about wildlife? They were like, well, nothing. It's a pain. It's just being conserved for white foreigners. And then one of the people he had visited several times, kept complaining about this elephant that had been coming to his house and making a mess. I forget what it was doing. It was maybe trampling on one of his water tanks or something. And Garth Owen Smith got kind of annoyed after having heard this story for the dozenth time, and said, well, we'll just have to have someone go out and shoot it then. And the guy, the fellow kind of looked at him and said, nobody's going to shoot my elephant. And Garth Owen Smith says, that's when I had some hope that that there was a commitment to wildlife that needed to resurface. And once people had the authority, and once the burdens and benefits of conservation were shifted a little bit, that they were able, no one was getting rich, but they were able to realize some benefits along with that authority, then they said, oh yeah, we never wanted these species to go extinct. We always cared about them. It just didn't seem to make sense to us to spend a lot of time caring for them. That was the government's job.
Right.
Yeah.
I love it. Let me turn back to our readers. We've got lots of great comments, and thanks for the book. Oh gosh. Well, here's a tough one, and you're probably not going to want to answer it directly. But can you? Basically, the question comes in from Chuck McAfee, who says, "Can you help me know which animal, I think, sort of wildlife protection outfits are effective?" He says he's bombarded with donation requests, and it's tough to know who's really effective here. Any broad guidelines or thoughts on sort of what people should be looking for?
I feel you. I have been donating lately, not that I have tons of money to donate, but when I do donate, I have been giving to Indigenous land tenure associations because, well, they're pretty grassroots. There's not a lot of your money going to overhead. And I think that Indigenous land rights and land tenure and ancestral land claims have so much to offer conservation. So if you have money that you're thinking, should I give it to one of the big green organizations or should I do something else with it? Check out organizations like Tero, Tero, the Land Tenure Foundation. There's several others I could list once I have my my names in front of me and make sure I have the correct terminology. But they are doing amazing work, and will make your dollar go a long way.
I like that. That feeds right into what we were talking about too. Question from Nick. Why do you think society is so drawn to the idea of de-extinction, yet seemingly much less concerned about preventing extinction in the first place?
God, I wish I knew. I mean, I think I know, right? Like, it's flashy. Wouldn't it be great? I feel about de-extinction the way I feel about climate denial. Wouldn't it be great if it wasn't happening? Wouldn't it be great if it were really possible to, bring these animals that we have driven extinct and made extremely rare so that they're functionally extinct? Wouldn't it be great if we could just produce them in a lab and let them loose, kind of like William Hornaday did 100 years ago, just put them on a train and send them out to Oklahoma? But it doesn't work that way, and I feel like the job of it's more fun to read about, something that, even though it might not be, I feel this myself, it's more fun to read about something that may not be happening, but is an easy, quote unquote, easy fix, or promises an easy fix, then then it's like, our conversations years ago about covering collaborative conservation. It can be tough, there's a lot of things slowing down and getting reversed, and, it takes forever. They're hard stories to tell, and I think they're hard processes to stick with, but we do know they work. And so I don't know how to, I think it's just human nature that we're drawn to the easy fix. But, one of my hopes in writing this book was to say, okay, that's not really an easy fix, but we do have a fix, and we can go forward through it with the knowledge that we know it works. Uh-oh.
Sorry, my mic is on and off. One of the folks you profile in the book is Michael Soulet, who is kind of an old friend and acquaintance of both of ours from Colorado days, and known as the father of conservation biology. And he described conservation biology early on as a crisis discipline.
Mm-hmm.
So in a crisis begets sort of an emergency response. And sort of the de-extinction movement seems to me to be sort of the ultimate emergency response.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And yeah.
But it's not a long-term fix, as you say.
No, and I wish Michael were still with us. He sadly passed away last year, as many of you know, or 2 years ago. And I think that crisis discipline makes sense, but I think it also has to be taken with a bit of a grain of salt. I think it can be taken too far. I think it made sense in comparison with the kind of science he was trying to depart from, academic science. He wanted to say this science is responding to a real world crisis. But I think the crisis of species extinction, species loss, biodiversity loss, that it's a long crisis, and I'm not sure that the phrase crisis discipline really captures the kind of stamina that we all need to stick with it.
Oh, you're not hearing me. Now I'm back.
Yeah, now I can hear you.
Comment from Lori. Lori says, I think rightly, local control should ideally be part of conservation, but in reality, even well-intended collaboratives can be hijacked by economic pressures within a stressed resource-based community. We saw this during the George W. Bush administration, right? Interior Secretary Gail Norton talked about the 3 C's, and I can never remember which C's, but it was collaboration and cooperation. And they, the administration really used that as a front to, drive resource extraction, oil and gas development across the landscape. So, this we've seen this be abused, and as you say, we've seen these efforts be kind of blown up by different players and outside forces. Thoughts on how to guard against that kind of thing? Or
yes, I totally agree. Like I said, when I covered these efforts 20 some years ago, it was happening. We saw the sage grouse effort get blown up by the Trump administration. And since sage grouse are really doing very badly now, and probably will require Endangered Species Act listing not too far from now, even after all that work put in by many well-meaning people. I don't have the answer. But I do think that some formalization of the role of local communities would be helpful. And that's, again, from what I said earlier about the difference between what I see happening outside North America and what I see happening in North America. I think a dedicated role and some authority to these local collaboratives would be helpful, and perhaps protect them from getting blown up from either side of the political spectrum. But that is not something I have looked into deeply or kind of played out with anyone who's been on the inside of these efforts in North America.
You do mention the kind of the elements of a successful kind of local conservation or community-based conservation effort, and there are like 3 of them, right? Do you remember what they are? Who's the researcher?
Well, I remember, I think, was it Garth Owen Smith who talked about what he felt worked in Namibia?
There was Garth, but there was also,
or is there something else?
The woman who did the research on this kind of work internationally. I'm looking for it right now.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Was it Margaret Jacobson?
Eleanor Ostrom.
Yes, Eleanor Ostrom.
Yeah. Of course. Eleanor Ostrom is, if I had to pick one person that if people didn't know they would remember after reading the book, it would be Eleanor Ostrom. She doesn't take up a whole chapter, but I just feel like her work showing that the tragedy of the commons is not, in fact, inevitable is something that all conservationists need to, kind of like the pocket constitution, you need to write that down and put it in your pocket and carry it with you. Because probably on a monthly basis, I hear some conservationists invoke the tragedy of the commons as if it is something that we're just doomed to. And that was the idea of this racist ecologist who wrote an essay for Science in 1968, and it's never left our brains, because we do see it happen, every day. But doesn't have to happen. And so Eleanor Ostrom was the Nobel Prize winning political scientist. She won a Nobel Prize for economics, actually, but who documented all these communities that had overcome the tragedy of the commons, or overcome the threat of the tragedy of the commons. And she was very resistant to writing prescriptions. She was always like, it's every community is different. Every setup is particular to its place and its people. But toward the end of her life, she laid out these design principles, and or what she called design principles. And they had to have set rules. There had to be consequences for people who cheated in one way or another. They had to be clear.
Right.
The rules had to be clear. And then the other important one I remember is that they had to have very good relationships with other levels of authority. And I think that might be what we're talking about here, is that there was a trust, a clear, transparent, trusting, however you want to put it, formalized relationship with, for instance, the regional authorities, the national authorities, even, in the case of Namibia, international authorities, because they work with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature on globally imperiled, when it's a globally imperiled species like the rhino. And then with, lower levels of authority, with heads of households. So I think, what we see in many collaborative efforts in the US is that there isn't a good relationship with, for instance, the national government, because there's no guarantee in place that the plan, for instance, the sage-grouse plan that stakeholders came up with during the Obama administration, there were no real safeguards protecting against new policies in a radically different administration. So I think that maybe if we go back to basics and refer back to Eleanor Ostrom's principles, there's something to be gleaned there in terms of making these efforts more worthwhile for the people who put so much time into them.
Yeah, I love that. We have just 8 minutes left. I'm sort of watching the clock a little bit, but I did want to. We've got a really thoughtful comment here from Joanna Nelson, who says Madison Grant is one of the 3 founders of the organization I work for, Save the Redwoods League.
Right, Save the Redwoods. Yep.
Yeah. So, and her comment is that we've done some uncovering and being transparent around founders, not just applauding us, saying she says she's not patting herself on the back, but she's all for opening the box and talking about who is in the conservation movement. I think that's really important. Yeah. And Michelle, you wrote a piece for The Atlantic. The big headline was "Don't Cancel John Muir." So, and this was sort of in response to the Sierra Club coming out, really kind of disavowing some of the comments that John Muir had made over the years about Black people and Indigenous folks. Do you see this kind of reckoning, throughout the conservation movement?
Yeah, and I will say, since we're among friends, I will say that I'll admit that headline was a bit of a troll, trying to get people who really didn't think we should cancel John Muir to read that article because the subhead was, "But don't excuse him either." And that's the way I feel about all the people in my book. I mean, and some of them were much worse than John Muir. I don't want to build a statue to any of them, that's for sure. But I don't want them to be forgotten either, because I think we can learn a lot from the good things they did know, and their insights that actually were really helpful, and from their horrible mistakes. Madison Grant was one of those who, and I said he was Hitler's favorite author. He wrote a book called The Passing of the Great Race that Hitler actually did say was, quote unquote, his Bible. This kind of pseudoscientific tome about the passing of the Nordic race. So Madison Grant he really conflated what he saw as protecting the purity of the wilderness or the purity of these species with the purity of his, quote unquote, race. And I think the redwoods were for him kind of a refuge from, what he saw as kind of whatever, the overly diverse society that he wanted to get away from, and a very elite retreat. But I think, yeah, transparency has to be the way to go. We have to have arguments, if there are arguments to be had over these people's legacies. And I think maybe the ground rules can be, if anyone has the power to set ground rules, certainly not me, but the ground rules can be, look, we're not going to erase these people or demand that they be, somehow like sunshine of the spotless minded out of our understanding. But we're going to try to appreciate them as the complex people they were, and acknowledge that, the terrible things and wonderful things can be true about the very same person. I mean, the recent discussion about E.O. Wilson is another example of that, where that discussion has been had many times, but I think maybe it's been had in a wider way since his death, that he was a man who was so gifted and prescient about other species and really not wise about his own. And I think we can take both of those things to be true. We don't have to fight over, it doesn't have to be zero sum.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Well, we are about out of time, but I think that's a good note to end on. I think I did want to go ahead. Well, let me just say quickly that I think sort of complexity, your embrace of complexity, is kind of the thing that I walked away from this book with. And we've talked about this before, right? We need to understand that people are as complicated as ecosystems, and it's going to take grappling with that complexity to solve the challenges that we're facing.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the water we swam in at High Country News, and have been swimming in. And I think that's one of the strengths of HCN, is we always gave space to the complexity. And I appreciate that more and more, because it's rarer and rarer. So I did want to quickly, I felt badly that I couldn't, Nia Taro is the land tenure organization I give to, and I couldn't come up with many other names, but I did want to list a couple for you. Rights and Resources, the Tenure Facility, the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities, the International Indigenous Women's Forum, and finally, IWGIA, which is the International Working Group for Indigenous Affairs. Those are all long-running, really reliable organizations, and really recommend. You can't go wrong with any one of those.
That's great. Well, Michelle, thank you so much. Thanks for being here with us today. This has been really fun.
It's delightful to see you, and delightful to see everybody here from so far away and close by. So
folks,
thanks for reading and supporting.
And thanks for all of your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. We'll share the questions with Michelle when we get off this call. Do drop your name in the chat if you'd like to be in the raffle to get a copy of Michelle's book. We've got 5 of these things to send around. We'll do a little raffle afterwards, just for fun. And just once again, thank you so much, everyone who joined us today, for supporting High Country News. This is a reader-supported nonprofit organization. We would not be here if it wasn't for you. Michelle and I, goodness only knows where we would be today if it wasn't for the incredible community of people who've rallied to keep this thing going.
Nowhere good.
Nowhere good, that's for sure.
Yeah, seriously, thank you. Thank you so much for supporting and for sticking with the organization. There's a long, proud history there, and a lot of it has to do with the commitment of its supporters.
Amen. All right. Well, have a great day, everyone. Thank you again for being here, and stay tuned. We'll do something like this again next month. Watch your emails.